redlining affected people of color, it affected African Americans, it affected Latinos, and it also built equity for white folks. And so anyway, you're going to learn a lot today about this project that they're doing at Cal State, and hopefully, many of you might go to Cal State one day. I hope that you would consider going into the Stern Library, visiting the Historical Research Center, and hanging out with both Chris and Donato. But I've talked long enough. So Chris, let me turn it over to you. Let's welcome Chris and Donato, please.
Hello, everyone. My name is Chris Livingston. I am the director of the Historical Research Center and Archives at California State University, Bakersfield. I also teach courses in the history department over there. Specifically, I teach archives and special collections and oral history methods. Today we're going to be talking to you about America's newest city. This is the title of our project, Housing Discrimination and Redlining in California's Central Valley. Donato will introduce himself here in a second. And then I just want to say that this particular program is made possible by funding through the California Humanities. So generous funding there that's allowed us to put our redlining exhibit on display, as well as continuing our research in redlining practices in Kern County. And so we're just now starting to dabble into what was going on in Delano. So Donato will talk about that here in a little bit. And then just if you're curious, this is, we call this the courtroom. This is Kern County court records going back to 1866. So there's a lot of interesting stuff in there. So today we're going to be talking a little bit about what the Historical Research Center is, what it is and what we do. I'm going to go into a little bit about primary source research, the nature and difficulties surrounding primary source research. Donato will take it over and talk about redlining and the aftermath of redlining here in Kern County with some examples that pertain to Delano. So the Historical Research Center, what is it and what do we do? Well, as Dr. Rosales mentioned, I spent 5 years at the Kern County Library in the Beale Memorial Library. I was in charge of the Jack McGuire Local History Room and also a reference librarian there. And I also managed some of the branches from time to time. And one day I get a phone call from the dean of the CSUB library, and he asked me if I was interested in coming back to CSUB to moonlight, basically work about 10 hours a week, because they were reestablishing their archives. Their previous dean didn't believe in keeping archives in the library. It was kind of an appalling thought to me that we wouldn't be collecting materials that document our history. But our new dean wanted to revamp that. So with a new dean, you get a new vision. After working some time there in my 10 hours a week, he approached me with the possibility of turning that into a 3-year contract, full-time contract. And this is where I sat down and negotiated with him, and not over salary, but over what the archives was going to be. And oftentimes, my experience as a undergrad, I'm sure, even in graduate school, I'm sure Dr. Rosales had some similar experiences. You don't learn how to access archives. You're just kind of thrown out there and expected to go access them. They can be very daunting, intimidating, and so that was my experience. I didn't want that to be the normal student experience. So typically when you go to an archive, you have to sign in, and you do that here in our archives, but you have to sign in and give blood, so to speak, and you get limited access. But what I wanted is for this to be a teaching and learning archive, and where our students can get hands-on experience in accessing archives. And so more student involvement was my first point that I wanted to talk to him about. And I didn't know that was going to turn into a partnership with the history department to develop 2 courses in archival management and research and oral history methods. So now we're teaching archives and special collections from both sides of the aisle, so to speak. So if you're a student that wants to go pursue a PhD and learn how to put your time in the archives, that class would definitely be beneficial to you. Or if you want to pursue maybe a public history track and become a public historian or an archivist or something like that, you would get something out of that class. The other thing was to expand our collecting mission. Typically, like here at Bakersfield College, the archives, their focus is on college history. They don't really do much community history unless it's related to the college, right? We do collect our university history at CSUB, but we've expanded it to include a larger focus on Kern County history, Bakersfield, Kern County history, the surrounding communities, and expanding even out to California and U.S. and world history. So that was something that we were able to get going as well. So who are we and what do we do? Well, so on that road to expanding the archives, with expanding your collection mission, you have to have space. And so we were able to add another approximately 4,000 square foot of space for storage. We also have a very robust digital program. So, archives are great unless you can access them, right? And I'll talk a little bit about the difficulties of access. So one of our missions is to digitize as much as we can and make it available so students and researchers will have access to it. One thing you may have noticed if you've done any search for primary sources is that not everything's been digitized, right? It's not like looking for a journal article. You can go into a database and find what you need, but a lot of times with primary sources, they're either located physically or the ideal source just doesn't really exist, right? We created a institutional repository, so that is basically a digital database. We call it, locally at the campus, we call it Runner Scholar, but it's part of the CSU system. It's called ScholarWorks at the CSU level. And this is a place where we store all of our scholarships. So students who do master's theses, students who do their senior theses, and then of course our faculty members can all deposit their research into this database. And a new corollary to this is the CSU just established a digital archive presence. So we have this same platform, but it's going to be dedicated to archival digital materials. And these will be materials that are available from all 23 campuses of the CSU. It makes your, possibilities just really grow with that opportunity. So I mentioned student involvement, right? Hands-on teaching type of thing. But it's also a place for students to get experience in, being in the archives and doing research projects and public-facing research projects as well. So one of the things we do is we have what's called the gallery group, and our gallery group are all students. So back up a minute, and we talked about the exhibit, right? The exhibit is based on Delano's research, but it was basically driven and written by our students. And so we do rotating exhibits yearly, and what we do is basically give the idea to the student, what we're wanting to do or what we're trying to, the topic we're trying to cover, and then they go through and do the research, the writing, with our guidance and the eventual installation of the project. So,
are those paid student positions? Or are they volunteers?
Some are, some aren't. So, for example, our next exhibit coming up that will open up in October or September, there is some grant funding that's paying for 2 student assistants to lead the project. But the gallery group is typically a volunteer group, but there's also an internship practicum that the history department offers. So if you're going to be a history major over there at CSUB, I believe English department is also, we're working out the specifics with the English department to do a similar practicum for them as well. The great thing about archives is you can be any major and you know, be an archivist, right? So, the internship is 30 hours for the semester, and so you get college course credit to work on these projects. So what we do is we basically match students with their interests. So if you want to get, you know, gallery experience and research experience, we could match you with the gallery group. If you want to maybe you have a specific research project in mind that you would want to do, you can do that as well. So so we're really flexible, and really the goal is to give you the experience that's going to help you achieve your goals, right? So you know, whether it be graduate school, teaching in high school, or teaching in community college, or beyond. So the other thing I had to do when we came over was to resume collecting university history. There was that pause because our former dean didn't believe in any collection at all. So we have this like significant gap in university history, and so we've been able to overcome that gap, I think, pretty well over this, really just recently with our now former president, Dr. Zelezny. She was very much a supporter of the archives and helped us start building the university history. So that's starting to gain some momentum. And then I already mentioned that, you know, the courses we teach. So we were able to embed the Historical Research Center into the curriculum. And not just with history, we have a new found partnership with the Ethnic Studies Department over at CSUB. We work very closely with anthropology and political science and English and even religious studies in the Kegley Institute of Ethics. So a lot going on there with that. And then we do a lot of community outreach, you know, not just coming out to the community to talk about our different research projects, but also assisting communities, the community and organizations in archiving their history. So we give advice and guidance in how to get archival programs started. We work very closely with the Kern River Valley Museum and other small community groups that aren't necessarily affiliated with institutions. So that's another aspect of our program. So just some pictures I wanted to share here. So Sam and Monique are both taken the archives class, and so Sam is our student assistant. We have 2 student assistant positions that rotate from time to time, so that's another employment opportunity. And then Monique is taken the archives class, and she's currently taking the oral history class. So, and she's really starting to bring the Sikh Punjabi culture into our archives. So she's helped us make connections in the community to start building those collections. And I might add that kind of the leading mantra, my leading mantra, is to erase archival silences, specifically in Kern County. And what I mean by that is, if you look at Kern County history, I'm just going to say it bluntly, it's very whitewashed. It doesn't really tell the history of people of color in this community. And I noticed that back when we were grad students together. I think we might have even had a conversation about this. I was trying to learn more about the Black community in Kern County. And when I went out to the Beale Library and I went out to the Kern County Museum, very limited materials there. And I was like, you know, but we know, these groups, these communities have been here. So how can we take communities of color from the margin and push them to the center, right? And so that's kind of our mantra in the HRC, and this is how we're building our collections. So there's 4 components of the Historical Research Center. We have the California Rare Book Room. This includes books about Kern County history. Our oldest book is from 1641. It's a book, it's a religious text. It's in Latin. It's a Theologica Prophetica. We use that as a demo for our students so they can see how books were bound and put together in the 1600s. Whole different process than now. It's funny because our students will look at it and they're like, man, this book is in better shape than the textbook I just bought from the bookstore. So we have the book room. It also includes California history and general special collections. Our oldest item is from the year 1245, and it's a book, a page out of a book, and it's in Farsi, and it's a commentary on the Quran. So 4 components: California Red Book Room. We have the archives, of course, not just local histories, but other materials as well. We have our gallery. So this is one of our galleries here. Our current exhibit is the Redlining exhibit. You can actually, if you can't make it down to campus to go see it, which I highly recommend, you can get a 3D virtual reality version of that on our website. So at hrc.csub.edu. So you can see what that is all about. And then, of course, we have our education component, which is our courses in archives and oral history. But I guess I should also add the internship class as well. So I've been talking a lot about primary sources and things like that. So let's just have a brief discussion about what they are, right? Because as historians, you're going to be using that all the time, but in other disciplines as well, right? Depending on what you're researching. The Society of American Archivists defines primary sources like this. So, first-hand accounts of events created contemporaneous, so at the time of the event, right? And later recalled by an eyewitness. So, what are some examples you can think of a primary source? Anybody have any ideas what an example might be?
My students do, they just redline.
The cosmic rays article.
Like a what?
The cosmic rays article.
Cosmic rays article?
Well, so I think you're talking about the writings of Jose Vasconcelos, but what's your name again? Roxana, tell Chris what you read recently.
The plan of Delano.
What was that?
Huh?
The plan of Delano was a document, kind of like a speech, of a farm worker, I think that was right, who was telling other farm workers that we need to fight for equal farming rights,
Yeah.
for better like working conditions, better wages, and just equality in general.
Yes, definitely. That's a prime example, right? A photo of Cesar Chavez giving that talk would be a primary source, right? A newspaper article about that event, at the time, would be a primary source. You see where I'm going there. This is another example. This is a will, 1641, that we have in our collection. The intent of this will was to dispose of an estate of a person, right? Not necessarily for the eyes of Bakersfield College students in 2024, right? But now we have the benefit of looking at what values and norms and rules were at play when this was written, right? And it gives us insight to the time period that we're studying, right? And that's why primary sources are so important. You're going to see some examples of racially restrictive covenants. And Delano is going to mention a lot about it. But one thing that stands out to me about these covenants, actually growing up in Kern County, by the way, I grew up in Arvin. I grew up in Arvin, went to Arvin High School. I am a first generation student in my family. Went to Cal State Bakersfield. I went to Bakersfield College also. But what I noticed in these, growing up, was the attitude was there wasn't really segregation or racism here in Kern County. There wasn't, you know, if there was, it was de facto segregation. You know what I mean by de facto? It was just the way it was. There were social norms in place that made this a reality. That there was not really any codification, anything down on paper that legally separated people by race. That was kind of the narrative I heard growing up. And when you look at some of the language, that is not the case. It very explicitly will say, if you're not white, you don't live here. Or if you are a black person, you will live here. And you'll see some examples of that. So that's where primary sources are so important, right? Because they're evidence to shape these narratives that we're used to hearing, to shake them up, right? To turn them on their ear and to challenge them also, right? But also to bring new context to understanding historical events. So that's what we're talking about with the primary source. And so it's important to know that, you know, they are the building blocks of history. They provide information. I think one thing we forget is that they can be misleading. We think it's going to be all factual information. This is an example I share with my oral history students a lot. Has anybody heard of the Battle of Los Angeles from World War II? It's the battle that never happened, right? The story goes, there was a Japanese airplane that was attacking Los Angeles, a lone airplane. The lights went up, tracer bullets in the sky, shot down a plane, and that was the story. My mother was like 10 or 12 years old at the time, living in Los Angeles, and to her dying day, she says, Battle of Los Angeles happened. I saw it. She said, I saw it. And she did. She sat on the sink with her mother, my grandmother, when the air raid was going off, and she watched the lights go up. She saw the tracer bullets go up into the sky, and then she heard the story afterwards. Dr. Maynard, I remember, he was one of our professors, awesome guy. He did a lot of research about the Battle of Los Angeles, and when he told me in class, or told us in the class that it was the battle that didn't really happen, I was like, right to my mom, and to tell her, this isn't really what happened, right? And she insisted. But even though it didn't happen, and it's kind of misleading, right? Maybe perhaps what happened. Is her story less valid, right? Even though she has one perspective of an event that really didn't happen, it does. There's historical value there, right? That culture, right? Stories, rumors, things like that are things that help shape our understanding of history. So often primary sources will offer original thought. They'll help you in understanding context, which is, I think, one of the most important things there. Of course, they aid in supporting arguments in your scholarship, right? You're going to be told in your history classes you're going to have X amount of primary sources, right? There's a reason for that. They can lead to new interpretations. Something comes up, a document that's newly discovered can change our perception on what we think about history. I'm going to talk about the case or the collection that launched Delano onto his research. It brought some new interpretations, and there's a lot of difficulties there, right? They're hard to find. They pretty much haven't been digitized. We are making inroads to getting things digitized across the profession. But they're difficult to access. If it's physical, you have to go to the archives. Donato had to go up in his research to the National Archives, and when he was getting ready to go, the government had a government shutdown, and so he couldn't go, right? So you have those types of things. The condition of the artifact is a problem. we have things in our archives that we just can't give access to because they're so fragile. So we have to maybe take a picture of it as best we can so that we can share as much as we can. They're often incomplete. You might have 2 pages of a 5-page letter in an archive. There's photos that might be missing, things like that. There's a lot of private collections out there, and that's a problem. So every time I watch American Pickers or what's the pawn shop thing, I get a little upset because these items are being sold in the private market, and yeah, okay, you're making money, that's fine, but that hurts us as scholars. There could be language barriers. One thing that we're noticing, actually it's starting to change though. How many of you learned cursive in elementary school? I did. So a few of you didn't, right? Well, our documents I showed you, the court records from 1860s, those are all in cursive and they're in iron gall ink, and so the ink is fading. And it's in cursive, and that, for some of our students, that's like a whole new language. So we're having to teach how to access that. There's also can be costs involved, reproduction costs, things like that. We don't charge for access to our archives to researchers. We never charge our students anything. We also assist with the researchers, but with the research. But the researchers that come from out of campus, we charge them for our time. So we never charge them for the item that you're looking at, but we have to take time out to reproduce these or what have you. So, and then you might have flat out denial of access. There are some collections that are under lock and key. We have a couple of political collections where a couple of files and boxes were deemed no access to the public until after a certain date. So you also have that kind of thing as well. So why am I talking about this for this presentation on redlining? Well, the main thing is to realize that we just didn't make things up here, right? We just didn't speculate. This isn't speculation. This isn't conjecture, anything like that. We let the sources tell the story, and we're just repeating the story that the primary sources are telling us, and we're providing those sources as evidence to support our what we found, but also to support our interpretation. Now, interpretations can be argued, that's fine, right? And we expect our work to be challenged, and it has been challenged. But that's why I talk about why primary sources are so important, and really to this presentation. And so before I turn it over to Delano, I'm going to talk about just this case here, or this collection. And this is the collection that really set Delano off on his research. This is the Claude Blodgett real estate papers. There's Claude Blodgett there. He was a Kern County real estate agent. He was from a pretty prominent family. He had a doctor and a doctor, I think a lawyer, and then a real estate agent in his family. Maybe a teacher as well. I think his mom might have been a teacher. But one day I get a phone call from Lori Ware at the Kern County Museum and said, there's this collection across the street in the storage. The family's getting ready to get rid of it. They're heading out of town. The museum doesn't want it. Do you want to go over and take a look at it? And I was like, well, I'll go ahead and look, And so I drove over to the museum, to the storage facility, and start going through this collection that's just jam-packed into this small storage container. And the first few documents I pull out are just like ledgers with numbers, and I'm like, I don't know. Maybe I can see why the museum might not want it. But I randomly picked up a book, and when I opened it up, there was reference to Mayflower. And this is what, as an archivist, it's important to know the history of your community. What I know about Mayflower, now I'm not an expert on Mayflower, but I do know that it was Bakersfield's first segregated community. So when I saw Mayflower, I'm like, I go right back to my graduate school year and thinking, wow, I could have used this, you know. I knew I had to pull this collection in. So I didn't have a truck with me. I had to get it all out like a van. So I stuffed everything in my car. I had books like hanging out the windows, you know, driving down trucks to get home or get back to the campus. And so it turns out that it's his real estate papers. So he was a real estate agent and it's all of his, not just the accounting, but also his, he did what was called buying on contract. I don't know if you're going to talk about that. And it concerned the Sunset Mayflower area. And so I signed a graduate student assistant to process the collection, and that was Delano. And after, I don't know how long did you have like a couple of days with it, and you came back to me and you said, I think I have a topic for a thesis here. And that thesis project turned into a completed thesis. And really, without that collection and without Donato's insight, I wouldn't be standing here talking to you right now. So without further ado, I'm going to, unless there's any quick questions.
We'll save time for questions.
We'll have questions afterwards, okay. I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Donato for the rest of the presentation. And thank you for your attention here. So.
Again, there's hot water, tea, lady fingers over here. I had 4 already. I ran 2 miles this morning just so I can have a bunch of lady fingers.
Hello, like, does it get volume?
There you go, Donato.
Okay.
Yeah.
I clip it to my
Either
belt.
clips or hangs, either one. Yeah.
All right. All right, well, thank you for having us. I'm going to start with the definition of redlining. I know you were all seeing the film earlier today, and you're going to see a lot of parallels, especially with racially restricted covenants. Some of those same tactics were adopted here in Bakersfield, and Delano, Arvin, Lamont. And and I'll kind of give an insight to how this project has kind of moved on now. Now we're actually going to go print the racially restricted covenants, and I'll kind of explain that, but we've identified more now. We're about 217 documents, where before we were at 117. So as we continue to research, we're developing more. And I'll even show a map. In recent years, I worked with a demographer, I guess with our student, helped me develop maps, and then eventually the research has kind of gotten to here as well. So in some cases, whenever you look at documents, over the years, I think you start to think of them differently. So as you look at, your primary sources and your professor says, hey, you should probably review your paper, you will think about it differently. So I encourage you in those ways. So I'm going to start with the definition of redlining. In recent years, the term redlining has become a shorthand for many types of historic, race-based exclusionary tactics in real estate. So the redlining comes from real estate, and that can include forms like racial steerings when a real estate agent tells you, wouldn't you like to buy in this neighborhood, or those grocery stores you like are closer to there, and that's discrimination, right? And that's why it's pivotal to understand some of this history, because if you have those conversations, to understand those are discriminatory tactics, right? And then from there, now the definition is kind of broadened out to more ways that have shaped and kind of informed us about racial discrimination and how resources are different now. So redlining is more of a loose term about racial discrimination. This is this definition from the New York Times. So I'll kind of start with some of the first history, some of the stuff that I found early on. So this is a fact-finding report from 1930 done by the governor, C.C. Young, who was actually a former real estate agent before becoming governor. And in this report, they sent questionnaires to counties and cities and said, do you segregate Mexicans? And Bakersfield reported back that they did segregate Mexicans. And some of those tactics in that fact-finding report, they said that some of the stuff that they used were racially restrictive covenants who only restricted land to persons of the Caucasian race. And this is kind of some of the first iterations that show that, that racially restrictive covenants were being used even before the FHA, HOLC era, and I'll kind of go over that as well, and some of the film touched on that as well. So the conditions of housing is something to look at too when you're looking at some of this research, and this is a report from a Bakersfield neighborhood, the Mayflower area, the one that Chris spoke about. So in this is Franklin H. Williams, which, and some of this will be consultation, I'll mention some historians, and Dr. Oliver's dissertation was very pivotal to understanding kind of the beginning of the research. I think it was your chapter 3, if I remember correctly.
The war on poverty chapter?
Yeah. So that was really kind of the insightful to kind of begin, right? And that's what more historians, you know, your professor will have you read articles, books, and kind of consult and have that conversation with history, right? So some of these iterations were from there, right? So eventually, most citations that Dr. Rosales had, I ended up finding that in an article later published. There was a letter. In there, they reported that there were no sanitary facilities in these neighborhoods, that they had pit toilets, which are outhouses, right, on the outside, and that the stench was, you know, recognizable, and that, you know, even though they had that people of color still found ways to build homes and buy land, right? And these are some of the homes, and they look kind of like home-built shacks. So the condition of housing at that time was you bought land if you couldn't get a loan, and you would take kind of a promise note with your broker to say, lend me some money, I'm gonna go buy some lumber, and I'm gonna build the home myself, right? So these are the conditions, and this is 1950, so this is not that long ago. It's like about 70 years ago. This is the state of housing, right? Especially as we think of like the end of World War II. I think a lot of common history is that, you know, we have a post-war boom, that the United States is going into what is going to be the modern United States, and yet this is a condition of housing for minorities. So that's when I'm going to talk about the Federal Home Loans Program. So the FHA, Federal Housing Administration, and the HOLC, Homeowners Loan Corporation. They were both created as New Deal programs. So as the United States is going through the Great Depression, they're creating these programs to kind of figure out the financing, the home state. You know, the FHA is still around, by the way. If you're a first home time buyer, you'll probably go through an FHA loan. And they also implemented racially discriminatory tactics. And then for those who have seen those redlining maps, they were in the video, the ones that are color coded.
We haven't gotten there yet, although we just did study the AAA, and so we are studying the New Deal. So I really appreciate you underscoring that FHA and HLC are government New Deal programs.
Yeah, so I'll talk a little bit about the maps, but then once you guys go over it, you guys can have a better discussion about those maps. So I'll kind of briefly touch on them. So in those maps, they color Kodo, and we saw some of that in the film, and they had kind of best to worst kind of grading. This is a Fresno map. Green meant you most likely got a loan and it was worth the bank's investment. And then, red was the worst, right? And I think even the film mentioned that it was quote unquote hazardous, not worth their investment. So Bakersfield does not have a map, at least not one that we found. And the reason that, at least what I've come to the conclusion, is that Bakersfield just didn't have a large enough population for them to draw a map. So with this research, we're just trying to pinpoint back that FHA and HLC practices were there, even if the maps weren't created. And this is an FHA evaluation grading. And in this is for East Bakersfield. They're saying, is it worth their financing? And some of the things they're looking at is it close to a civic and social and community center, right? So that becomes pivotal to financing, right? So is there going to be a shopping center? Is there going to be a school? Is there going to be a hospital? Very much things that we think of as urban infrastructure, right, that supports your daily living, right? Well, very much communities of color usually don't have, right?
No, I'm so sorry. You said that's the Fresno redline map?
Yes.
So what is, for those of you who are familiar with Fresno, you would see then that the redlining area, I would assume that's a large minority population.
Yeah.
What is the dividing, is that a train track? What is that right there? Can you see that? What is the divide line there for the border of where that red line is? I mean, it goes all the way across the map. Is that a train track or is that a road? Do you know?
It's hard to tell. I haven't really.
That's pre 99, I would assume.
Yeah, it is. Yeah.
So maybe that's a railroad track or something.
Probably, yeah. And then eventually, and your professor has pointed out to the point of detail. Eventually, highways will become big dividers, right? Eventually, you will have references to the highway dividing like minority areas. So I'm gonna look into that. That's a good question.
Yeah.
And your professor raised up a very great point. So the red areas were most likely the areas where people of color live, right? Least likely to be invested, least likely to be even financed, right? They're saying that they're not going to finance these places. And it's because, in their valuation grade, it's the area with least investment, right? The worst schools, no shopping centers, and things like that. So, as you're thinking of where you live, is just like, am I close to proximity to a grocery store? What do my streets look like? and things like that. That very much still, from what we learned the other day visiting with the Bakersfield city, is that they very much still use a version of this to figure out if areas are worth investing, right? Do they look at schools, they look at other things, but these things still very much, still very matter, and what we're telling them is that, you know, these were tactics of discrimination, right? So if they still use a certain similar formula today, it's inheriting some of those discriminatory kind of effects. So, what are racially restrictive covenants? So, in 1938, the FHA and their underwriting manual, which was their manual that they taught lenders how to buy, how to sell, taught them ethics, and really kind of professionalized their practice. In their underwriting manual, they taught real estate agents to segregate. So this is from the manual. As is G, prohibition of the occupancy of the properties except by the race for which they are intended. So in the manual, this is very much like kind of a cookie cutter template, right? So real estate agents that want to buy and sell, a lot of them really adopted this formula. And even Chris and I saw those. A lot of the sections are, you know, like this, and it's very much very standard, right? So they very much took a lot of influence, even to the point of just copying and pasting this, right, into their contracts. So, and I'll mention my historian Paige Glosser, and she pinpoints that this isn't really unique, especially for the FHA, because they're reaching out. The FHA is formulated by the National Association of Real Estate Boards. Now it's the National Association of Realtors. And when they were creating the FHA, they tapped that organization. They had already been segregating the Midwest. So whenever they're brought in to create the FHA, they bring these practices with them. This isn't necessarily unique, but since they had already kind of formulated the tactic of restrictive covenants, the tactics of racial exclusion, they bring that with them, right? So this is, when the FHA is formed, this is not necessarily something they invented. It's something that they had already been doing for years, right? But what changes the FHA is that this brings it up to a national event, right? This standardizes selling over the United States, right? And it's gonna, you know, kind of keep the resources to a single demographic, right? This is, you know, as your professor mentioned about equity and how this shapes neighborhoods and everything, this is gonna be very pivotal, right? Especially in that time period when people are trying to build out of poverty.
I just want to say to the students, because you all are students, right? One day you'll graduate, one day you'll get your job, and one day you'll want to buy your own home.
Yes.
And you will have to talk to a realtor. And so that's what Delano is talking about. He's talking about the realtors that you'll eventually have to deal with and the professionalization that they went through. I mean, they're creating segregation through that policy that's on the screen. So keep that in mind, 5, 10 years from now.
Yeah. So
when you have your job and you're buying your house and you have to hire a realtor.
yeah, and so your professor brings another great point. The National Association of Realtors was just sued for an antitrust kind of practice of commissions, right? So that just came out, I think, like in October, and it's going to be implemented, I think, in July. So this is the same organization that implemented.
They're not always going to get that 6%.
Exactly, right? So, you know, I remind, you know, like sometimes it's good to reform their practice. It's good to question some of these things. So as I hope, at least in the end of this, you think about questions, you know, like how do they represent me? How does it represent my wealth in the next 10 years, especially if you're thinking as, you know, equity or investment or even generational wealth, passing that wealth to your kids, right? So this becomes very pivotal. So this is actually language from Bakersfield neighborhood. And it says, no part shall be used or occupied or permitted to be occupied by any person not of the white or Caucasian race, except for such persons as are engaged in bona fide domestic employment of the owner thereof, holding a set under owner. So this is very similar to that language that the previous documentary was talking about, right? I mean, it's very standard, very similar. Domestic workers, white only. And we found 217 whole neighborhoods that have this exact language.
I don't mean to derail
Yeah.
your presentation or to move to the Q&A, but
Yeah.
I mean, at least for my students in Chicano history, they just read an article on whiteness and Mexican American identity and how, you know, Mexicans were Caucasian for so much of the 20th century. I'm curious if in your research, how does that play into it? You know, if Mexicans are, like my parents' birth certificate says they're Caucasian, how might that play into housing markets and how Mexicans are segregated?
So it's complicated, right? And your professor is alluding to a common phrase called passing for white, right? People of color, black, Mexican, a lot of people have done that to gain the agency of buying, of selling, and going around race restrictions, right? I think there, you could probably elaborate more there. There's I think it's a complicatedness to like Hispanic identity, especially when you come back from Mexico, and if you're not indigenous, like an indigenous specific group in Mexico, and you come to the United States, there is a feeling of white or Caucasianness, right? Especially in relation to kind of a Spanish, ancestry, right? So I think it's complicated, but when you come to the United States, you don't always get to participate in whiteness, right? So that's the other complicated part. So when you do leave, in any part of lower, either Mexico, Guatemala, El Salvador, and you come to the United States, it's a different race dynamic than what you were born and bred into. Mexico and South America is more like classes, right? More economic classes. And they are divided by race, specifically to indigenous people, so it is complicated, but when you come to the United States, some do and some don't get to participate. It really depends on your kind of skin tone, right? So you have what's it called? I forgot what the term is called, but whenever, like how light you are, right? So if you're light complected, you can pass for white. If you're not, right? And I'll even give you like a personal insight. I used to have a manager, I used to work in AutoZone, and he's like, oh, I thought you were white the whole time until you said this one word, then I realized you were Mexican, right? And that kind of tells you like the different dynamics of like what people believe, what they perceive. So in some ways I benefit from passing of white, but in some cases, people do confront me with it, and I'm just a weird interaction. But so it's complicated, right? And I think your professor is kind of when you're reading these things, think about criticalness, right? Like are they benefiting for some, or some are not? What does it mean to be Mexican? What does it mean to be Hispanic? What does it mean to be also generationally Hispanic American, but have been here for like the last 100 years? And what does it mean to to be American that long, right? And so it's extremely complicated. It's also complicated to be like recent. My parents were immigrants. I'm a first generation born here, and that's complicated too. And it might be complicated for someone who came as a childhood arrival, right? So I think your first points to something that it's not always the same, right? So prior to 1938, and this is kind of alluding to some of those National Association real estate boards tactics. This is a newspaper ad from 1924 where they're kind of advertising that they're forming a realty group, and in there that they say that they will restrict the land to white only. To it says the lands herein conveyed shall never be at any time sold, or actually it's this one. Sorry. That all lots will be restricted to not less than $1,000 dwellings, as well as to members of the Caucasian race. No saloons will be permitted on property. This is before 1938, before the FHA, so we can see that some of these covenants are before the FHA era, right? And this is a deed from someone selling their land to the city of Bakersfield, and they have that racially restricted language in 1924. This just kind of show that the practices were there, but not necessarily as expansive after the FHA era, right? So this is the kind of the real estate agent, right? And it's professionalizing the real estate agent, and that's why I mentioned the lawsuit and other things. And it's important to look at the practice of real estate in general. So the historian Gene Slater, he speaks about how in the 1920s the real estate agent was something that was bad, something that there had been a situation where a real estate agent had pretty much gotten property from someone who was elder, and he had like swindled her, and they had got national attention. The real estate agent was someone who was stealing from people. So they developed a code of ethics in response to reimagine the real estate agent, and they came up with the word the realtor. Now the realtor isn't a real estate agent. The realtor has a code of ethics. The realtor is bound by these rules, by these regulations, and so a lot of people have been pointing out the rules and regulations, their so-called code of ethics, also contain a language of segregation, right? So Article 34 of the Code of Ethics for the National Association of Real Estate Boards A realtor shall never be instrumental in introducing into a neighborhood a character of property or occupancy, members of any race or nationality, or any individual whose presence will be clearly detrimental to property values in that neighborhood. So a lot of this history is tied to what is related to financial investment, right? The redlining maps are so-called financial security maps, right? Where they're looking at these neighborhoods and saying, all right, if they are diverse, that they're not worth investing, that they don't see financial value in that, and they're reinforcing that in their ethics manual. In 1950, the California Real Estate Association, now the California Association of Realtors, everyone's kind of rebranded themselves after some of these documents are really like, they're very tied to discriminatory practices. So a lot of them, like 1974, the National Association of Real Estate Boards became the National Association of Realtors. The California Real Estate Association is now the California Association of Realtors. So a lot of people they're still piggyback on that realtor word, that they're still professionalized, there's still work licensing. And in there they have, a realtor shall never be instrumental in introducing a neighborhood, a character of property or use, which will be clearly detrimental to property values in that neighborhood. Similar tactics as the National Association of Real Estate Boards. So, and this resulted in the willingness of individuals to hoard resources, right? To hoard advantages and opportunities. And this is from historian Colin Gordon, who writes exclusively about racially restricted covenants. He shows that these limit, right? And this really challenges the view of separate but quote unquote equal, right? That keeping all these neighborhoods white, keeping all these neighborhoods away from racial minorities really kept resources away from people, right? And so where you live, you got to think outside. It's where I shop, where I take my kids to school, even where I go to college, right? So someone looking at like, where's the college put on, right? Is it on the best land? Is it closer to areas of poverty? Am I able to walk to my college or my university? Some of those things are in result intentionally, right? I think some of the historians have challenged us to really think of neighborhoods and things as unnatural, right? As things that we create intentionally. And some of this history, I mean, this is all documentary, it's all based on documents to show kind of the artificialness, the constructiveness of segregation. So this is language from McFarland and Delano, so they're both in close proximity. These are the neighborhoods. And some of this I'll kind of point out that they're really close to schools, right? Remember, this is the grading, right? Close to schools, close to parks, close to districts, similar dynamics, close to schools, close to parks, and this is before the highway era. So the highway, this is a modern map, but these are the old neighborhoods before the highway was put in. But we look at grading, right, and to look at like what financial investment looks like, and it's clearly that they are next to the best resources, right, the schools, right, and when I look at this research, I think about that, right, and also think about modern, like where I live truly does matter, right, and being able to buy anywhere is incredibly important, right.
Delano,
Yes.
did you color coordinate that?
Yeah, so we did on Google Maps.
Oh, yeah, but
Yeah.
so that dark green, you did that.
Yeah.
Oh, so tell us again what that represents?
So dark green is white only.
Okay,
And-
so that's
and
an
then-
area of town
Yes.
where, okay, that was racial.
And we
So
did
that
it-
would be on that's east Delano, I would assume that's east of 99?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah. I think you point to something important. I think there's a lot of oral history to say that the highway divides,
Yeah,
right, divided Mexicans and whites.
yeah.
So it is east. Yeah.
So you actually found some covenants from that neighborhood?
Yeah, so these are the Delanos, the Park subdivision, track 1436, 1434. There's not that much because Delano isn't really that big during that era. And then McFarland is track 1461, track 1374, 1377. And I'll kind of go into detail, but the language is, said premises shall not be used or occupied by any person who is not of a white or Caucasian race. And we labeled them green to kind of follow the coordinating with the HLC maps, right? The green would be financeable, right? So as we see all these quote unquote white only neighborhoods, they also mean they're gonna guarantee financing, right? This is gonna be the best area of town, the schools, the maps, and it's gonna be things that support, at least that era of financing's terms, right? So, you wanna get the photo of the
Oh,
map?
no, yeah,
Okay,
if you don't mind, yeah.
Yeah, go
I'm
ahead.
actually sending this to Andrew Vaughn, my colleague.
Yeah.
Yeah, Sorry,
Okay, and we'll go into it more specifically, because I have some of those. So this is the Delano.
that is cool.
This is near Cecil Avenue, near the middle school, near the Delano Union High School, and the district, right? So the valuation of grading, right, that I really look at is near schools, near shopping centers, first grade properties, right? And it's reserved for white-only neighborhoods. And this is specifically the language from the Delano neighborhood. And it's interesting, it has a double, which I still need to figure that, why they doubled the race restrictions, but section 6 says no part of said lot or building or site shall be at any time sold, conveyed, leased, or rented to any person not of a white or Caucasian race. And now you're gonna hear a more specific version on 7, which is the same document, which is interesting. It says no part of said property, lots, or building sites shall be at any time be used or occupied or permitted to be used or occupied by any person not of the white or Caucasian race. So it's doubled, and it's interesting that they doubled it, because I don't really see that. Usually you see it one time, so it's Caucasian only, unless you're a domestic employee, and then they went and added section 7, which says the same and more, which is interesting.
I know
Yeah.
that you probably have more to your presentation, I just wanted to, we have about 10 minutes till my class ends.
Sure.
So I just want to definitely say sometime at the end of the Q&A. But the other thing I was going to say is, as you think about the future, I mean, I wonder too, like labor camps, like, oh man, I don't know if it's possible when we think about mapping segregation to add in labor camps.
I think
because
so.
they're not part of the city periphery, but like, so many of my students, when they do these oral histories, their families lived in
Yeah.
labor camps.
You know, I think that's very important. I'll second that, because have you read In Search of Mexican Beverly Hills?
Oh, yeah.
Jerry Gonzalez. So he talks about how they kind of got rid of the farms and built homes on them that the people that lived in those labor camps couldn't buy.
Yeah.
So it'd be interesting to see Delano's version, you know, which is put the labor camps as, you know, they're kind of being phased out, and now we're looking at farming becoming housing.
Yeah.
The question is, can those people who lived there in the past
Yeah.
purchase those? Are they priced out?
Yeah.
Right? What does a new home built on farmland cost these days? So I think you bring very future questions that impact us today, right? So I think it's important to map those, right? Bus routes and other things, access to neighborhoods, because you know, urban infrastructure is all about that, right? Where you live truly does matter, and if you live where you work, what does that mean, right? So this is kind of just, I'm getting more into the Delano stuff, and race restrictions, they're really kind of shape, you know, your kind of real lived experience, right? And that it reinforces inequalities in housing, government, social capital, job opportunities, environmental hazards, crime, and everything. So this is an advertising kind of like to the tourist industry in Delano, and it's saying find schools that Delano has the best schools. And then we can see in some of the, this is race restrictions from Bakersfield, where we see specific races. So this pinpoints to your professor's question about what about Mexicans, right? So this one specifically says people of Mexican descent, right? Not color, not race, it's specifically Mexican, Japanese, Chinese, and African, right? And as we're diving more, we're finding more specific language. We even found some blood purity clauses that if you weren't wholly in blood to the Caucasian race, that you couldn't live there. So I think that even pushes on to the term of passing, right? That if you weren't wholly white or all in blood, that you could not buy there. So now I have an excerpt, and your professor actually interviewed Jesse Alcala, who is an activist. He speaks a little bit about the situation, education situation in Delano.
I'll tell you how my first memories were grammar school. At that time, they didn't have pre-K, they didn't have kindergarten. I remember going straight to the first grade. Didn't know any English at all. And I remember being with some of my schoolmates. As soon as that bell rang, you know, we would take off. We thought it was time to go home. So, and that happened for a couple of weeks until they started tying us up. They used to tie us up to these poles over the hallway. They had poles that would tie us up so when the bell rang, you know. So I had to learn English real quick, you know. And I remember, I don't know if I was in the third grade or second grade, but I came back to tutor first graders to teach them how to start to speak English. It was actually against the law to speak Spanish at the time. Okay, So we gave up all our desires to talk Spanish, even with our families, even with our mom and dad. You know, we would understand and we could communicate with them, but the rest of the time was all English.
You had mentioned that your parents were farm workers. Did you ever do any farm
yeah.
labor as well?
Yeah, I was working when I was probably maybe 9, 10 years old,
In grapes?
picking
or-
grapes.
Grapes.
Yeah, I was lucky. I wasn't migrant. My dad was one of the foremen at one of the vineyards there. We didn't, we didn't migrate like everybody else. But I remember all my friends would take off, after the grape season. They take off up north to pick plums and whatever. And school didn't get filled up till December after Christmas. So all my buddies would come back and say, "Hey, where you been?" "Oh, we've been in San Jose. We've been here. We've been there." And I almost envied them because they were traveling all over the place.
Yeah.
But and that was the norm. The school board in Delano was all white, most of them growers, very prejudiced.
This is kind of a small excerpt to just show, like, whenever they advertise fine schools, I question for whom. What is a lived experience of others, right? So as they're advertising Delano as a new urban place in the 1960s, this experience is very stark, very, very completely on the other side at the exact same time.
I'll tell you how my first memory.
So, now we're going to continue. So, in 1948, there was a Supreme Court case, Shelley versus Kramer. In Shelley versus Kramer, they resulted that you could not take a racially restrictive covenant to court to enforce it. That means that you had one in your property, you couldn't sue someone to not buy your home, right? And this doesn't necessarily solve segregation, but what it does, it stops people from writing racially restrictive covenants. Now, that isn't true for everywhere. I have a colleague in Phoenix, Arizona, who said that it continued basically into the Fair Housing Act. And Bakersfield, they ended in 1950, and I have an assumption that it's related to the FHA's decision that year where they said that they would not finance homes that had racially restrictive covenants. Now, that is contradictory too, because my colleague in Phoenix, he says they continue to do it, and I'm sure they continue to get financing. So this may not been, enforced. They some did adopt this, some didn't. It seems to be sporadic over the United States. So for our mapping, at least for the whole subdivision era, which is when they built homes like in uniform style, they all look the same, painted the same, in neighborhoods that were marketed the same, it changes a little bit different, right? And they start using language of harmony, right? It's with the balance of the neighborhood. Or even they use that, within their idea of financial investment, so the rate they hike up the prices, right? Yeah.
No, I don't mean to,
Yeah.
I just want to draw your attention that we're really rapidly
Oh,
running
yeah.
out of time. We only have about 4 minutes left. I was hoping that there's 2 things that you could just share before we kind of close it. Do you have the Bakersfield map that you created?
Yes.
And then also, if you could just say, a quick pitch about the actual physical exhibit that students could go see.
Oh, yeah. So.
I know we really need like 2 hours for you
Yes.
Well, as Donato's pulling this up, again, the map that he's going to show you is, if you've been to Bakersfield, it's really a reflection of the hard work that they've done crunching these and mapping these covenants.
So let's say we were getting ready for this presentation. We added the covenants for Delano and McFarland to our website. So if you do want to see them and see what neighborhoods they are, I kind of put what the neighborhoods look like today. It's kind of pinpointed there. These are the tract maps to show like what the original layout was and how it changed. So it has iterations. This is the park tract, park subdivision, and it kind of goes through there. So we got just some to kind of sample what Delano was looking at. And we also have McFarland as well. So, and then here's the map. Let me go ahead and bring it up. So the map does center on Bakersfield, but if you zoom out, you do have like the
that's so
McFarland,
cool.
right? I know it doesn't do justice because it just centers on
You're
Bakersfield.
really mapping segregation in the valley.
Yeah. So that's what we started in, to kind of show, and then I'll kind of just tell in on this. The exhibit is called America's Newest City, and I think I have.
2 more minutes, please.
Okay.
Yeah, I need to
Oh,
ask you.
you're good. Sorry. I was like, I'm on time. But anyways, so this is the exhibit, and you can see it on our website. And the reason it's called America's Newest City is because Bakersfield goes through an earthquake in 1952, and it triggers like a new urban investment that comes out of Bakersfield. And while other cities get to abandon their downtowns, whoever's been like to Sacramento, they have like a historic downtown, then they have a new downtown. Bakersfield doesn't abandon theirs. They get to reimagine it, right? And with that comes an influx of millions and millions of dollars. They build new schools, they rebuild the churches, they rebuild the infrastructure. Bakersfield is very much in that style of 1952 still, but they built the recreation lakes like Lake Mean, Lake Willoms right here. And it really triggers a whole investment into the county, right? So that's what we named it America's Newest City, because it's really the reimagining of the space, urban investment within the face of segregation, right? What does urban investment look like for people of color? And that's why I had the, and I'll kind of just go through it real quick back into it. And it's the Delano, the growth of Delano is directly influenced from the earthquake from 1952. And it's advertised as a city designed for people. This city is planned for livability. Delano welcomes you. And as you look at some of the farm worker history, does it truly welcome everyone? That's some of the questions that I ask. So
That is, we unfortunately have to wrap it there because it is 11. Let's give them a round of applause, please.